Welcome to Exploring the Underground Railroad in the West, a public forum hosted by the National Park Service in collaboration with the Organization of American Historians. I am Elaine Jackson Rotondo, Preservation Partnerships and History Programs Manager with the National Park Service Pacific West Region Cultural Resources Division. Tonight, our panel of scholars are live streaming from the Fort Mason Center for Arts and Culture in San Francisco, which is located within the lands that have been home to indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The indigenous peoples of the San Francisco Bay Area have cared for these lands and the living things therein since the beginning of time remembered. Their ancestral ties to San Francisco and its surrounding landscapes have persisted through periods of colonization, violence, and injustice, and remain strong to the present day. Slavery, freedom-seeking, and the Underground Railroad are often associated with eastern states and territories. By contrast, many celebrate the history of the West as one filled with innovation and personal freedoms. Although California and Oregon were admitted to the United States as free states, their constitutions allowed enslavers to bring enslaved people to California and included a clause to exclude people of African descent from settling in Oregon, thus limiting African Americans' personal freedoms. Washington was admitted to the United States after the Civil War. However, during the antebellum period, Washington Territory permitted enslavement. Scholars today are examining freedom seekers' individual courage and the actions they took to secure their freedom. It is critical to illuminate these stories of resistance as communities continue to struggle for freedom, justice, and equity. The public forum will allow our panelists to share thoughts from a scholars' roundtable held over the last 3 days and provide an opportunity to discuss ongoing academic work. Through this process, the National Park Service and Organization of American Historians hope to identify future partners and stakeholder groups interested in documenting, preserving, and sharing this history. The National Park Service is honored to work alongside the Organization of American Historians to facilitate this conversation among leading scholars of slavery, freedom, and the American West to help us better understand the history of the Underground Railroad in California, Oregon, and Washington. We value their time and the research they have been willing to share with us over the past few days. Any statements made by the scholars are their own and are not statements made on behalf of the National Park Service. We welcome and encourage your questions tonight. Type them in the comments and we will address them during the Q&A portion of this event. ASL interpretation and live captions are available tonight. You can follow the links in the description below. They also have been dropped in the chat. I now would like to introduce Paul Zarecki, the Director of Public History Programs with the Organization of American Historians.
Thank you, Elaine. The Organization of American Historians is the largest professional society dedicated to the teaching and study of American history. Our mission is to promote excellence in the scholarship, teaching, and presentation of American history. We encourage wide discussion of historical questions and the equitable treatment of all practitioners of history. For almost 30 years, we've partnered with the National Park Service on important projects like this one. I'd like to take a moment to recognize and thank the National Park Service, our panel of scholars for sharing their insights and research with all of us, and Golden Gate National Recreation Area and the Fort Mason Center for Arts and Culture for hosting us at this location. I'll now turn it over to Camille McLaren, Program Coordinator with the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, to share information about that program.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening. My name is Camille McLaren. and I'm one of the Northeast regional managers with the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program. The network's mission, through collaboration with local, state, and federal entities, as well as individuals and organizations, is to honor, preserve, and promote the history to the enslavement through escape and flight, which continues to inspire people worldwide. Through its mission, the Network to Freedom helps to advance the idea that all human beings embrace the right to self-determination and freedom from oppression. The program is a catalyst for innovation, partnerships, and scholarship that connects and shares the diverse legacy of the Underground Railroad across boundaries and generations. We're here tonight because we understand that the Underground Railroad looked different in different parts of the country throughout history. The West in popular culture is dominated by tales of the gold rush and its financial promise, manifest destiny, and the realization of the American dream. While this narrative may ring true for many, not all people experience the West the same way. African Americans were brought, and some also ventured or fled into the mining camps of the West, particularly California, after the Mexican War. Several court cases in the 1850s revolved around the fate of freedom seekers. Take, for example, the story of Stephen Hill. Hill's enslaver, Wood Tucker, brought Stephen Hill with him to California during the gold rush. Eventually, Tucker left Hill behind in California to return to business in Arkansas. Out of his enslaver's control, Hill on his own built a successful mining career, purchased and developed his ranch, and quickly made a respected name for himself in his community. When Tucker and his agents had Hill arrested and tried to retake Hill's property as their own, the community came together and helped Hill escape slavery and reclaim his property. To this day, we do not know what happened to Mr. Hill after escaping slavery. Yet we know that this act of resistance is one of several documented escapes in the West. Enslaved individuals in the West, both of African and indigenous descent, actively resisted involuntary servitude. This resistance took many forms, from pressing for personal autonomy to acts of disobedience, small and large, to the final of escape. Today, Stephen Hill's story is represented in the Network to Freedom Program's Tuolumne County Courthouse, where legal actions related to his case were conducted. Many people today envision the Underground Railroad as the series of safe houses located throughout Quaker settlements where groups of progressive white abolitionists where enslaved people migrated from house to house until they reached Canada. However, in reality, the Underground Railroad, one of the nation's first civil rights movements, it's complex more than that. The Underground Railroad the Underground Railroad, or resistance to slavery through escape and flight, always coexisted with the institution of slavery. Wherever slavery existed, people escaped. The history of the Underground Railroad centers around the brave people who dared to escape slavery, whom we refer to as freedom seekers. Without freedom seekers, there would be no Underground Railroad. Since its inception in 1998, the Network to Freedom program has worked with communities across the country to document sites, facilities, and programs with proven connections to the Underground Railroad. In 2009, community members came together and nominated Old Tuolumne Courthouse, the center of the legal maneuvers against Stephen Hill, as a site in the Network to Freedom. Other programs and sites are currently documented in California, including grave sites and virtual Underground Railroad experiences. Yet, there are more stories to discover and preserve. You're about to hear from the scholars who will discuss the context of freedom seeking, slavery, and resistance in the West. We are honored to be part of today's discussion and eager to continue uplifting the stories of freedom seekers from California and the Pacific West. Without further ado, I'd like to hand the microphone to our distinguished chair for discussion, Dr. Albert Broussard. Mr.
Thank you. My name is Al Broussard. I am a professor of history at Texas A&M, where I have been teaching for almost 40 years. I teach courses in Black history and U.S. history, and I've been writing about the history of California and the West, specifically the role of African Americans in the West, for more than 4 decades.
Good evening. My name is Andrés Reséndez. I'm a professor of history at the University of California at Davis, and my own specialty is colonial history of Mexico and parts of what is now the American Southwest. And I have devoted some years of my research to the question of indigenous or Indian slavery, and it is in that context that I come here to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Stacy Smith, an associate professor of history at Oregon State University. My main specializations are the American West and also the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. And all my scholarship and most of my teaching aims to kind of bridge those two fields and put them in conversation with each other, and specifically to study the enslavement of multiple groups of people in California and sometimes other places in the West, and to relate that to the national freedom struggle happening in the North and the South.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kevin Waite. I'm a Los Angeles native, though now I teach U.S. history at Durham University in the UK. I wrote a book called West of Slavery, which is a history of slavery and the Civil War in the American West, and California in particular. And now I'm working on a book on Biddy Mason, an enslaved woman from Georgia who was forcibly transported across the continent, won her freedom in Los Angeles in 1856, and went on to become one of the most prominent members of the Black community in Los Angeles.
Good evening. My name is Katrina Jagodinsky. I'm the Susan J. Rosowski Associate Professor of History at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. My research focuses on the legal history of the American West over the long 19th century. My first book, Legal Codes and Talking Trees, chronicled 6 indigenous women who filed their own claims before state courts in Arizona and Washington. And I'm now looking at other marginalized peoples who use the law on their own behalf in courts throughout the American West.
Studying the Underground Railroad in the West is still in its very early stages. We know that slavery began in English North America, centered in the southern states. It therefore suffered from a southern and an East Coast bias, and indeed that historiography is more than 1 century old. The famous bibliophile Charles Blockson, in fact, lists no western states, nor does he list Texas, in his own network to freedom. I think it's important as we try to resurrect this history in the West to look at not only famous slaves, celebrated cases, but also ordinary people, individuals, fugitive slaves who fled west and tried to find better lives. The Network to Freedom also includes free blacks and should include free blacks and how their communities and their institutions aided fugitive slaves. And that will necessitate reading their documents, newspapers, convention records, fraternal societies, political organizations, to understand how they interacted and assisted fugitive slaves. Fugitive slaves viewed California and the West as a place of opportunity. They were guarded, they were cautiously optimistic, they were certainly not naive, but they did anticipate a better life for themselves and for their families as they escaped to Western communities like California, Oregon, and Washington. White abolitionists, as well as black abolitionists and ordinary citizens, each assisted fugitive slaves in their quest to be free men and free women. But fugitive slaves in the West, just like those in the East, relied largely on their own resources when they escaped. They were not lured away by abolitionists, either black or white. The Network to Freedom also includes slaves escaping to Mexico and using occasionally maritime sources, as well as escaping by more conventional means to escape slavery. There is still a great deal, however, that we need to know and we need to learn.
Okay, as we consider this great story of both enslavement and freedom seeking, we need to cast the net quite widely. It is tempting for us to think about this story as beginning with the transatlantic slavery and moving into the eastern seaboard and then continuing onto the west. But this is only one possible strand of a much deeper and more complicated story. We need to begin by recognizing that slavery, enslavement, and captivity already happened in the American continent before contact. There are plenty of examples and plenty of evidence of this happening all over the continent, including what is now the Pacific Northwest, where indigenous groups, for example, sealed marriage alliances by exchanging captives and slaves. So slavery was already here in this continent before the arrival of Europeans. Europeans, however, arrived and transformed these pre-existing forms of enslavement, changed them, commodified them, and increased the geographic scope of these forms of enslavement. And in the particular case of the West, this happened initially not from east to west, as we are used to thinking about, but it actually happened from south to north, as European colonists came initially from central Mexico, moving north up into what is now the area of the American Southwest. And so this is the complicated landscape that finally American colonists encountered in the middle of the 19th century as they started moving west in vast numbers. And in fact, if you look at some of the diaries of these westward bound settlers, you see their amazement at the complicated landscape of enslavement that they encountered. And so it is in this broad canvas that we need to understand the history of enslavement and also the history of freedom seeking in this region of the West, because we need to understand that it was not just flight and escape was, of course, one mechanism, but it took cross-racial alliances. It took also uprisings, indigenous and African-American uprisings as well as the use of multiple legal systems in order to seek freedom. And so it is important to cast our net this widely. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is Stacy Smith, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that folks have already mentioned and then kind of riff on them a bit. And so the question I'm going to talk about is kind of what is the Underground Railroad and did it exist in the West? I think we've already established a lot of that context already, but I just want to reiterate some of these themes that we've already heard, which is there are lots of myths and misnomers associated with the Underground Railroad. As I tell my students, it was not literally underground and it was not literally a railroad, first of all. And I think sometimes the public understanding of what it actually was is kind of distorted by that name. But instead, a very secret set of illegal networks by which enslaved people made their way out of the slave states, usually to freedom in the northern states and Canada. And there is this kind of mythology that it was highly organized and mostly operated by white abolitionists, and we know that that is not especially true, and mostly not true, that really it is operated by enslaved or formerly enslaved people with some of their white allies, and that it tended not to be this highly organized, institutionalized set of safe houses that one would go to and then travel up north, but really kind of varied in its level of formality, size, and the destination of freedom seekers. So it's a really diverse network to freedom. And so if we think about the Underground Railroad in this way, did it exist in California? And I'd say yes, but not in the same way. Something that we've talked about in the panel quite a bit was the difference that happened here in California California was already free soil, and the enslaved people who arrived here were usually forcibly brought here, had a forced migration to California. And once they got there, it's not as if they were escaping from a slave state to a free state, but instead they were enslaved in a free state. And most of the time, freedom seeking happens when free African Americans and sometimes their white allies join together and bring a suit against a slaveholder for holding someone against their will and against the laws of a free state. So it's a fundamentally different process in California because it's already on free soil. Usually we don't have people escaping across state lines, and so the legal process is very different. If we think about size, one thing that scholars have often noted about the Underground Railroad is that actually a very small number of people were able to escape via these loose networks, probably a few thousand, but we don't really know the statistics. And if I would say anything, it's California, it's probably even smaller. We're talking about a few dozen individuals at the most. And so if anything, the networks in California are probably even more informal. I don't know that we can say there is any kind of really organized, institutionalized system of rescue and movement of people to freedom, but rather a more spontaneous kind of ad hoc coalescing of the Black community and their white allies around specific individuals at specific times and specific places. The last thing I'll say about all of this is that the geography of movement has some similarities with the Underground Railroad of the East Coast, but I think is a little bit different in California. Through our discussions, we've talked here in the last few days, talked a lot about the maritime or aquatic nature of freedom, especially in California. This was also, maritime connections were also important in the eastern states as well. Lots of Black sailors and maritime workers participated in smuggling people to freedom, and ships and sailing were often methods of escape. And I think that also holds true in California, but I think it may even be more pronounced in California, given the importance of maritime networks here, given that literal railroads and even decent road systems were not well established in California, that river travel, sea travel, et cetera, were really important modes of transportation. And so I think that if we think about just the geography and the environment in which that movement happened, probably the California story is an even more dramatic example of the so-called saltwater railroad that some scholars have identified happening in the East, where people are moving by sea to spaces of freedom. And so I really, just want to emphasize in conclusion, right, the Underground Railroad, yes, existed on the Pacific coast, but it's a really different legal landscape, I think. It's different in its size and level of formality, and the networks of mobility and movement look differently here.
Great. So I want to try to briefly answer a question that sort of underlined our discussion these last 3 days, and that's, why is this history, the history of slavery and freedom seeking in California and the American West, still relatively unknown? And I imagine, a lot of you at home had an experience relatively similar to mine, and that you didn't cover this history in school. And personally, that's not because I didn't have excellent teachers. I really did. But that's because when I was in school in the 90s and early 2000s, this history wasn't really on anybody's radar. And I think that comes down to two main factors that I'll outline briefly here. The first is that in the major narratives of the history of American slavery and the Civil War era, California remains something of a land apart. California usually appears briefly in these narratives, usually in a chapter on the Compromise of 1850, in which California is admitted to the Union as a free state, and that seemingly is the end of the story of slavery in the American far west. At that point in this narrative, California sort of recedes from view, and the narrative shifts back to the American Southeast and the American Northeast. Stacy and I in our books are trying to counter that narrative, and we're in a group of scholars that are working against the sort of standard East Coast-oriented narrative of the Civil War era in the history of slavery. And the second reason that this history, I think, remains to a certain extent buried is that it has everything to do with who is writing this history, and you can probably see where I'm going here. And to highlight this fact, I want to take us really briefly into San Bernardino in the early 1850s. So by some metrics, San Bernardino, which was founded as a Mormon colony in 1851, was the most prosperous settlement in Southern California in the mid-1850s. I mean, according to some contemporary reports, its agricultural production outstripped the combined production of Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, and San Diego. And that prosperity was built in large part on the backs of enslaved people. About 24 enslaved African Americans labored in San Bernardino during this time, and an untold number of Native American slaves. So by this point, by the mid-1850s, San Bernardino is California's largest slaveholding colony. And really, it was hiding in plain sight. Visitors came to San Bernardino, and they commented on the existence of slavery within the settlement, and then they just sort of shrugged. And historians have repeated that sort of disengagement with this history. Nobody has really studied the history of slavery in this slaveholding colony in any detail. There's this massive doorstop of a book that in a lot of ways is excellent, detailed, thoughtful, that gives us a really complete picture of San Bernardino during this period, except for the presence of enslaved people. There's virtually nothing on the experiences of these people in the 500 or so pages of this book. And I think there's a reason for this oversight. And that is, the earliest histories of San Bernardino were written by the descendants of the elite slaveholders, the founders of this colony. And these histories claim that the enslaved people of San Bernardino weren't really slaves. They lived in this sort of ameliorated condition of servitude, and that they were in fact free to leave the colony if they really wanted to, but they simply didn't. Well, once you start piecing together the little shreds of evidence, often left by the enslaved themselves, it becomes very clear that that's just palpably false, that this was indeed slavery, and this was indeed a slaveholding colony. These were the enslaved people who made San Bernardino remarkably successful. So I'm going to try to leave it on a more optimistic note here, and draw attention to the fact that there's a new generation of historians trained in new methods, telling new stories, more attuned to the voices of the enslaved and freedom seekers. And so that this history of slavery, and most importantly, freedom in California and the American West is, slowly but surely being unearthed.
In addition, over the past 3 days to focusing on questions of slavery and resistance in California, we've examined other forms of bondage and freedom seeking throughout the American West. And something that has really come to the fore is that Black enslavement under the American system overlapped with Indigenous enslavement, Pacific expansion, and the exploitation of immigrant laborers. And so my research examines the legal strategies of marginalized people over the long 19th century collectively, thinking of the way in which Black, Indigenous, and immigrant people shared legal strategies to counter the shared oppression and exploitation that they faced. So not just in California, but also in Oregon and in Washington, Black petitioners used habeas corpus as a means of freedom suit to challenge slavery. Famously, in Oregon in 1852, Robin and Polly Holmes sued their former owner over the custody of their children, who he continued to enslave, and they were successful in redeeming their children from slavery in that suit. In Washington Territory in 1860, Charlie Mitchell used habeas with the Alliance of Black Abolitionists in Victoria, British Columbia, to challenge his enslavement under James Tilton, who was actually the surveyor of Washington Territory, successfully. In the aftermath of abolition, former enslavers and those who were interested in maintaining coercive labor systems were very creative about how to continue to exploit people of color and those who are not citizens. And so new forms of coercion sort of emerged in California and other places. And these included things like coercive indenture and coercive guardianship systems. So Indigenous people found themselves subject to minor Indian indenture laws. And as early as 1871, Lucia Martinez, a Yaqui woman in Arizona, sued the father of her children, the white father of her children, who had kept them in bondage, using habeas corpus essentially as a freedom suit, in the same way that Robin and Polly Holmes had used habeas to redeem their enslaved children. After Lucia Martinez's 1871 petition, you start to see other Indigenous parents using habeas to challenge child removal, both in terms of coercive confinement, but also in places like boarding schools. And this is throughout the American West, Arizona, New Mexico, Alaska, and other places as well. In addition to Indigenous people, Chinese immigrants used habeas essentially to challenge deportation, particularly after the 1875 Page Act, which subjected especially Chinese women to charges of prostitution. And in their petitions, they described circumstances that resembled enslavement and trafficking that Black women had also faced prior to the Civil War. So again, similar structures of confinement and coercion, but also similar strategies to resist that experience and that system. In addition to Indigenous and immigrant petitioners, people who were brought into the United States through the Pacific Rim also used habeas to challenge what they described as forms of enslavement on the Pacific Ocean. So in 1885, for instance, Fanny Fowle, an Aboriginal woman, sued the captain of a British ship in Seattle, charging that he had actually abducted her in Australia and kept her confined in his cabin while the ship sailed from Australia to Hong Kong to Victoria and then into Seattle, where she was finally freed. The reason that she was found is because the very same sailors on that ship had also charged the captain with keeping them under confinement. And so their habeas petition collectively yielded hundreds of pages describing what was essentially enslavement on this British ship. Collectively, these petitions tell us that people continued to rely on coercive forms of bondage and exploitation, but that just like Black petitioners had used habeas as freedom suits prior to the Civil War, others learned that strategy and applied it in new and novel contexts well into the end of the 19th century.
We now have time for Q&A, so keep your questions coming in the chat, if you will. Well, this is an interesting question. I'll start with this. If people of African descent were not citizens, how and why are they referred to as African American? Any thoughts?
I mean, I think that is the reason that, oh, did I do that? I think that's the reason that some scholars have chosen to say Black people, enslaved Black people, rather than African Americans, to kind of acknowledge that they were excluded from the realm of citizenship. I guess I would counter that by saying, yeah, like legally, Dred Scott decision in 1857 may have said that African Americans were not people, or were not citizens, but African American people contested that greatly, and there was a lot of other evidence that, in fact, a lot of states did acknowledge them as citizens, and the Dred Scott decision as devastating as it was not the be-all, end-all of claims about citizenship for African Americans. And so I think it's important to note that just because legally they're not defined as citizens in state or federal courts necessarily, African Americans continue to assert their citizenship regardless of these legal claims. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that.
In a lot of ways, African Americans by the mid-19th century were far more American than most white people. They may have been excluded from citizenship, but their ancestors, many of their ancestors, had been working North America for hundreds of years. Their ancestors were buried on the ground that they themselves worked. So like Stacy says, I think African Americans or Black Americans or however we want to categorize them would deeply contest the notion that they weren't in fact American.
And I would add to that, prior to the passage of the 14th Amendment, when we get our first clear view of who can and cannot be a citizen, Frederick Douglass had made the argument convincingly that if blacks fought for the Union courageously, which they did during the Civil War, that would be the best, he said, case to be made for them being citizens of the United States. Also, I want to say that there was not a federal definition of citizenship, but there were state definitions of citizens. So African Americans indeed could be citizens of the state, but not regarded as federal citizens, again, prior to the 14th Amendment. Okay? Let me read the second question, and this is one that we grappled with for 3 days. Where are these perspectives of the West documented with sources and/or original records? Took a stab at that, Andres?
Sure. Well, I can say one thing that unlike African slavery, in the case of Native American slavery, it is a little harder to document because we are talking about people who did not necessarily cross an ocean, and so we don't have the port records. And also we're talking about raids that took place regionally, and because it was technically illegal, at least within the context of the Spanish Empire, then we don't have the same kind of documentary record in terms of wills or in terms of bills of sale that we have for black slaves. However, we still have a continuous paper trail that enable us to document this phenomenon, even if we don't have the same kind of documentary record for Native American slavery.
I would also share that it's really quite eye-opening to simply go through county, state, and federal legal collections where you find an abundance of Black, Indigenous, and immigrant petitioners who aren't just filing for freedom, but who are also suing for property or who are challenging other forms of mistreatment. And so our very own American legal record is ripe with these kinds of stories and histories. It's just that they've been sort of under-indexed and therefore underutilized. But anyone who has the time and benefit of being able to read through them case by case will find that oftentimes there can be silence in the archives, but in these records, they're extremely loud, right? It's quite to the contrary of that instance.
And I would add that if you look at the original documentation and the primary sources of free blacks in the American West, particularly in the state of California, there's a plethora of newspapers, many of which are started by blacks who came from eastern states like New York and Philadelphia, but they also were black conventions in New York, which mirrored those of the Negro Convention movement from the 1830s to the early 1860s. There are records of fraternal societies, there are records of conventions, political leagues, that sort of thing. But legal records, they appear frequently in the legal records because the law, much like the law during the period of slavery, going all the way back to the colonial period, is replete with examples of what black people can and cannot do. So let me read the third question I've got, a little tricky. If we consider the New Spain census of 1790, where 20% of those enumerated of African American descent, what happened to the African influence in the West?
Right. This is a very good question. The Spanish Empire operated, which bled into what is now the American Southwest, operated as a racial hierarchy. And so there's a multiplicity of terms used to describe the phenotype of different peoples. However, once the Spanish Empire disintegrated and Mexico became independent in the 1820s, these racial categorizations became banned from the official documentation. And so that really severely complicates especially the identification of people of African ancestry in the record, because many of them especially started melding into other categories, at mixed categories, or the so-called mestizo, so that is people of mixed indigenous and European ancestry. And so it is harder to maintain these very clear-cut racial categorizations in the case. So that's why it's a lot harder to do that.
Okay. I have another great question. Are there any stories of Native Americans and African Americans acting in cooperation to gain freedom and or to help each other? And the short answer to that is yes, but I'm going to let the panel go into more detail. Did you guys get the question?
So, I mean, if we're talking about the Southeast, there are lots of examples of this. And, but I'll talk specifically about California and the anecdote with which I begin my book in order to sort of show the complexity of slavery and race in California, is a case from the late 1850s in San Francisco, where there's an enslaved girl who is spirited away by black abolitionists. She is dressed as a boy. They change her name and hide her out in the countryside so that her enslaver can't find her. And this all looks very much like a kind of freedom seeker, fugitive slave situation that we might see on the East Coast, until we realize that the child in question, the enslaved child in question, was actually a child of an indigenous child from Northern California who had been enslaved, taken as essentially as a house servant at a young age with her enslaver's family in San Francisco. And we actually have black abolitionists apparently aware that this is happening and trying to move her toward freedom. And so it's a very rare example, but I think it's a really important, interesting example of this kind of collaboration that could happen in the West. Really unexpected.
We also know that Africans and Native Americans intermarried. They could be adopted into the tribe, or they could be sold as slaves as well. And we know that this cooperation transcended just borders, because we have examples of cooperation between African slaves and indigenous people in colonial Peru, in Mexico, in Cuba, right? So it was not just in the United States, but yes, we do have documentation that there was cooperation between these groups. Why do you use the word enslaved instead of, quote, slave?
I do so taking the lead of a number of scholars of Black history who include people like Gabriel Foreman, who are interested in focusing on the full breadth of Black experience and not thinking about the category of slave as being the defining characteristic of a person's life or status. And so thinking of enslaved as a way of describing how they were perceived and held from one perspective, but understanding and certainly exploring the full range of status, identity, and experience that they would have engaged in the broad sort of spectrum of their human experience.
I, for one, have been shouted down at conferences for using the word slave. When I teach my Black history courses, I explain on the very first day that I'm going to use these terms interchangeably. because we don't know the names, the identities of most enslaved people. And I want to imprint in the minds of my students, irrespective of what race they are, that these are human beings just like you and I. They had feelings, they had families, they had children, they had hopes, they had dreams. And so to the extent that we can preserve either their identities, and sometimes we do know their names, or whatever degree of humanity we have, then I refer to them as enslaved people. And so I use these words interchangeably, but it has become almost an act of, a political act in many cases to use the word enslaved people. And I'm very comfortable with that. I'm an author of a best-selling textbook with Monroe-Hill, and this was a debate that I have had with our editors for more than a decade, where they basically have crossed out the word slave, and they have used the word enslaved people because they think it is a far more sensitive term to use. Okay, another question. What's the process to become a member of the Network to Freedom? And I'm going to invite a member of the staff to answer that question.
The process is, can be achieved in many ways, but what we try to do is try to find or rediscover and discover stories of flight and escape that have direct connections to the Underground Railroad. But the process is actually detailed on our website. You can Google it by typing in National Park Service, National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom Program. And just a little bit about the process itself. You can actually come into the actual program three ways. One is by the actual site itself, a facility, or a program. And take, for example, here out west, we've identified sites, programs here out in the west, and between about 7 or 8. And for example, one facility out here in the west is the California State Library for records on fugitive slaves. Two sites I like to highlight is the Mary Ellen Pleasant burial site in Napa, California. And then you also have, which was seemed kind of interesting and peculiar, is Mary Brown, the wife of John Brown. She's actually buried in Saratoga, California. And then we also have a program called Footsteps of Freedom, tour in Riverside, California. So I say all this, there's several different ways you can come in to the actual program. And the process itself is, once again, detailed on our website. But the first step is, if you feel like you have a facility, site, or program, you should come to our website and reach out to the regional program manager, be it in the Northeast, Southeast, or out in the West. And we will sort of begin that process and walk you through that process, and we do that by reviewing applications.
Thank you. So for 3 days, we've talked about both free blacks and enslaved people, slaves who were brought with their owners to California to work in the gold mines during the gold rush, and in some cases set up claims, established claims, and some were quite successful, and those claims have been documented. So this question pertains specifically to that part of the history. Have any of you worked with geologists to study the connection between the literal routes within the Underground Railroad, such as mining, network to freedom, and economic opportunities for freedom seekers? Has anyone?
Geology?
Yes, with geologists, that's a question.
I'm not aware of that, but you know, there might be room for collaboration there. I think more. I mean, it seems like the disciplines that would be perhaps more helpful for thinking about that would be historical archaeology, thinking about how to excavate sites and make those visible, especially since many of these are not extant in the United States. And then I'd also, you know, of course, think about the ways that geography specialists may be able to kind of have some input on how these networks of people looked and how they flowed across time and space. So those are the two fields that I think could really benefit this kind of study. I just don't know enough about geology to know whether that would be a helpful interdisciplinary connection with this history.
Yeah, so like Stacy, I'm not aware of any historians working with geologists, but there are a number of historians who are especially attuned to geography and the ways that that opens up opportunities for freedom seekers. And Stacy, to my right, is one such historian who explains really well how the geography of Gold Country, how the communities that are formed by slaveholders and the enslaved people that they brought with them create unique experiences for the enslaved, and in some cases, experiences for escape. I mean, the California frontier was open. It wasn't heavily policed like the slave societies of the South. There were no slave patrols per se. So it was easier to escape, but then from escape, it was much harder to find security, I would say.
Okay, so we have a quite different question here relating to the post-war period. What role did blacks who established towns like Allensworth play in the freedom-seeking movement, the Network to Freedom of the West? Did they have formal legal representation? Really a two-part question. You want to give it a stab?
Want me to start?
Please.
I'll start by addressing the sort of legal status of African Americans in California. And one of the greatest hurdles to their empowerment in the state was the fact that they were not legally allowed to testify either for or against white people in the court of law through the 1850s. And so this made them highly vulnerable to capture, and made them highly vulnerable, even free African Americans, to enslavement. So long as a white person claimed them as a slave, they couldn't, in a court of law, contest that claim themselves.
Stacy, did you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I think it's, the post, one thing that the question raises is just the kind of the post-war era and where we think about the Network for Freedom, or when we think, how long did it last, the Network for Freedom? Because these towns that we're talking about are late 19th, early 20th century, and would we still consider that to be a range of time for thinking about the networks for freedom and freedom seeking extending that far? I don't know, right? And so there's kind of an issue of chronology there. When do we think of this history as ending, and were African Americans who were migrating to California for economic opportunity long after the end of slavery, were they, is that an example of freedom seeking that isn't kind of in the traditional flight from slavery sense, but this, the idea of people migrating for greater opportunities and greater freedom. So it's I think that question kind of highlights the difficulty of thinking about, well, when does this history end, and does it end at slavery or long beyond that into Jim Crow?
Okay. So I've actually seen numerous documentation and maps of the town of Allensworth, and I've always put the town of Allensworth into the context of Black utopian experiments in the post-war period. And we know that there were more than 60 or 70 all-Black towns, and Allensworth, I believe, was part of this phenomenon. The town did not last for very long. Most Black towns did not. But they nevertheless were still viewed as a source of pride, racial pride, where African American children could be, among other things, free of discrimination. Blacks could control their own lives and perhaps not worry about the kind of segregation that they face, whether in the South or in the state of California. So I believe it still is on the map and can be visited, and Allensworth has been, I think, rightly recognized as a result. A couple of other questions. This is a great question. Are there historical sites that one can visit similar to plantations that we have in the East, or I would say in the South as well?
The short answer is yes, there are a number of sites, but a lot of the original buildings don't remain. So I'm thinking in particular of the courthouse in which Biddy Mason and 13 other women and children won their freedom in Los Angeles. This was the largest African-American freedom suit in the American West. The courthouse where they won their freedom is located more or less where LA City Hall stands today. So you can certainly visit the site. You won't find any marker to that history at the site, but if you're there, you know you're standing on an important site in the history of slave emancipation.
And I would say this holds true for many black towns, whether it's Deerfield, Colorado, or many of the black towns that were established in the West in the post-Civil War period. This is a question we grappled with as well a day or so ago. How does one respond to those who insist that documentation must include written and published authorities, otherwise it cannot be proved? We talked about the silences and the gaps, for example, in the record.
I really would just encourage a broader sense of possibility for what's in the archives themselves. Everything that we're talking about, all these specific examples, come directly from the case files, are documented in manuscripts from people of the period, documented in newspapers from the time period. So these are deeply archivally based studies and stories. And I think the reason that they're not so widely known is just because of how difficult it is to access them, frankly. There aren't necessarily strong indexes. So as an example, if any one of us were to walk into a county courthouse and ask for their historic records, you may or may not find an index of those records. If you do find an index of those records, it doesn't necessarily tell you that these party names, Smith versus Jones, were black people. You have to do the additional work not only of pulling those records, reading them, but then also cross-referencing them to census, newspaper, and again, manuscript collections from the time period. So that extensive work is what everyone at this table has been doing over the course of our careers to really try to illuminate these, again, richly documented, but largely underutilized sources.
So this is precisely what I meant in my very last comment when I said there's still a great deal we do not know. And so if we look at legal records, that does not tell us the full life or full range of activities about a human being. And so sometimes it's up to us to try to fill in the silences or fill in the gaps by reconstructing the community or reconstructing the lives of people around that individual. And yes, we're going to make mistakes, and sometimes we're going to make errors, but I think that's the best we can do. Take someone like Mary Ellen Pleasant, for example, who lived a very influential life, and yet we have a very, very good scholarly biography of Pleasant, even though we don't know all the details of her life, including her work as an anti-slavery and leader and abolitionist during her lifetime as well.
Thank you for spending this evening of information with us. Thanks to Professor Broussard and our team of scholars. And thank you, the Network to Freedom and the Organization of American Historians. We are excited to share information about the National Park Service, National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program, and learn more about ongoing research and scholarship into freedom seeking in the West. We hope this forum is the start of more dialogue and collaboration with our agency and grassroots community efforts to better preserve and tell the story of the Underground Railroad in the West. To learn more about becoming a member of the National Underground Network to Freedom, please head to the website. Again, thank you for your participation in tonight's event, and we look forward to working with you in the future. This concludes tonight's program.